Picture this. You're standing at the altar on what should be the happiest day of your life. The church is filled with witnesses. Cameras are rolling. And then, in one horrifying moment, you discover the person you're about to marry is your own child. This isn't some twisted Hollywood plot. This is the true story of Father Michael Harrison, a respected New York priest whose wedding day became a nightmare that shocked an entire community and ended in blood at God's altar. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about family, faith, and the secrets we bury. Stay with me until the end, because the twist in this story will leave you questioning how well you really know the people closest to you. Before we continue deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Father Michael Harrison wasn't just any priest. For 15 years he had served as the beloved pastor of St. Matthew's Catholic Church in downtown Manhattan. Every Sunday, hundreds of parishioners filled the pews to hear his sermons about redemption, forgiveness, and finding your way back to God's light. But Michael Harrison had walked a long, twisted path to get to that pulpit. Born and raised in the Bronx, Michael's early life was anything but holy. At 19, he was just another kid trying to make it in New York, working construction jobs, partying on weekends, and dating whoever caught his eye. He had no plans for the priesthood, no calling from above, just a young man living life day by day. That all changed one cold December night in 1995. Michael had been drinking heavily after losing another job, and in a moment of reckless anger, he'd gotten into a fight that left another man hospitalized. As he sat in that jail cell, waiting for his lawyer, something inside him broke. He looked at his hands. Hands that had hurt someone and made a promise to God that would change everything. If you get me out of this, if you give me another chance, I'll dedicate my life to you. The charges were eventually dropped, but Michael kept his word. Within 6 months, he had enrolled in seminary school, leaving behind his old life, his friends, and most importantly, a girlfriend named Sarah Martinez, who was 3 months pregnant with his child. Michael never knew about the pregnancy. Sarah had discovered it 2 weeks after he'd left for seminary, and by then, he was already deep into his religious studies, convinced that his past life was exactly that, past. Sarah, heartbroken and alone, gave birth to a baby boy she named David. Unable to care for the child as a single mother working 2 jobs, she made the heart-wrenching decision to give him up for adoption to a family in Buffalo. For the next 25 years, Father Michael Harrison built his reputation as a man of God. His congregation adored him, church officials praised his dedication, but deep in his heart, he carried the weight of loneliness that comes with celibacy, and the nagging feeling that something was missing from his life. In the summer of 2020, a young man walked into St. Matthew's Church during evening service. David Coleman was 25 years old, strikingly handsome, with dark hair and deep brown eyes that seemed to hold years of pain. He had recently moved to Manhattan from Buffalo, working as a freelance photographer, trying to make sense of his life after years of feeling disconnected from his adoptive family. David had been searching for something, purpose, belonging, answers to questions he'd carried his entire life. He'd grown up knowing he was adopted, but his adoptive parents had been loving and supportive. Still, there was always that hole inside him, that need to understand where he came from and who he really was. When David first heard Father Harrison speak, something clicked. Here was a man who talked about finding redemption after making mistakes, about God's plan even when we couldn't see it, about family being more than just blood relations. Week after week, David returned to those evening services, always sitting in the back pew, always leaving quietly when the service ended. It took 3 months before Father Harrison noticed him. During a particularly emotional sermon about forgiveness and second chances, the priest's eyes found David in that back pew, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. There was something familiar about the young man's face. something that stirred a memory Michael couldn't quite place. After service that night, Father Harrison approached David. "I've seen you here every week," he said gently. "I'm Father Michael. Would you like to talk?" David looked up, and when their eyes met, both men felt something they couldn't explain, a connection that went deeper than priest and parishioner. "I'm David," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been searching for something. Your words, they help me make sense of things." They talked for 2 hours that night, sitting in the empty church as streetlights cast shadows through the stained glass windows. David spoke about feeling lost, about never quite fitting in anywhere. Father Harrison shared his own story of redemption and finding purpose through faith. Neither man could have known they were staring into the face of their own flesh and blood. What started as spiritual counseling slowly evolved into something much more complicated. David began volunteering at the church, helping with community outreach programs and assisting with evening services. Father Harrison found himself looking forward to their conversations more than anything else in his week. The other parishioners began to notice. Mrs. Catherine Walsh, who had attended St. Matthew's for 30 years, whispered to her friend after Sunday service, "Have you seen how close Father Harrison has gotten to that young man? It seems unusual." But most dismissed it as a priest taking special interest in helping a lost soul find his way. By Christmas of 2020, the relationship had crossed lines that neither man fully understood. Late-night conversations in the church office became dinner meetings at quiet restaurants. Spiritual guidance became personal confessions about loneliness and longing. Father Harrison found himself questioning his vows for the first time in decades, while David discovered feelings he'd never experienced before. "I know this is wrong," Father Harrison confessed to David one snowy evening in January. They were sitting in the priest's private chambers, the fireplace casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I've dedicated my life to God, taken vows of celibacy, but being with you, it feels like I'm finally complete." David reached across the small space between them and took the priest's hand. "Maybe this is God's plan," he whispered. "Maybe we were meant to find each other." That night, they crossed a line that would eventually lead them both to destruction. The secret relationship continued for months. Father Harrison would finish his evening prayers and meet David at a small apartment the young man had rented just 6 blocks from the church. They would talk for hours about theology, about life, about the connection they felt that seemed to transcend anything either had experienced before. Father Harrison began to believe that perhaps his calling was changing, that God was showing him a different path. He started researching the process for leaving the priesthood, convincing himself that true love was also a form of worship. David, meanwhile, felt like he'd finally found the family he'd been searching for his entire life. By the spring of 2021, Father Michael Harrison had made his decision. During a private meeting with Bishop Thomas Rodriguez, he announced his intention to leave the priesthood. "I found someone," he explained, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was saying. "Someone I want to spend my life with." The bishop was shocked but not entirely surprised. He'd noticed changes in Father Harrison over recent months. A lightness in his step, a different quality to his sermons. "Michael," the bishop said carefully, "you've served faithfully for 15 years. Are you certain this is what God wants for you?" "I've prayed about this every night for months," Father Harrison replied. "I believe love, in all its forms, is sacred. David has brought me closer to understanding God's plan for my life than I've ever been." The process of leaving the priesthood would take time, but Father Harrison was determined. He began preparing his congregation, speaking more frequently about love, commitment, and the different ways people serve God. Some parishioners were confused by the shift in his sermons, but most trusted their beloved pastor's judgment. David, meanwhile, was planning their future with the excitement of someone who'd finally found where he belonged. He'd started calling Father Harrison Michael in private, preparing for the day when the man he loved would no longer be bound by clerical titles. They talked about having a small wedding ceremony, maybe at a different church, maybe even at City Hall. But fate had other plans. By December 2021, Michael Harrison had officially been released from his vows. It had been a difficult process. Some parishioners felt betrayed, others were supportive, and church officials were concerned about the scandal it might create. But Michael was free to marry, and he and David began planning their wedding for Valentine's Day 2022. They decided to hold the ceremony at St. Matthew's Church. Despite everything, the congregation had agreed to let their former pastor use the space for his wedding. It felt right to both men. The place where they'd met, where they'd fallen in love, where they'd found each other. David was radiant during the weeks leading up to the wedding. He'd never been happier, telling friends about finally finding someone who understood him completely. "It's like we were meant to find each other," he would say, his eyes lighting up. "Like we're family." If only he'd known how right he was. The invitations were sent out. David had invited his adoptive parents from Buffalo, though they were uncomfortable with their son marrying a man 25 years older. Michael had invited the few family members he still spoke to, including his sister Maria, who lived in New Jersey. It was Maria who brought the box of old photographs to help decorate for the reception. She'd been going through their late mother's belongings and found albums from Michael's youth, pictures from high school, college, and his wild years before seminary. Among them was a photo from 1995, Michael with his arm around a beautiful young woman with long, dark hair and brown eyes. "Who's this?" David asked, looking at the photograph while they decorated the church hall the day before the wedding. Maria glanced over. "Oh, that's Sarah Martinez. Michael was head over heels for her before he went to seminary. Beautiful girl. I always wondered what happened to her." She paused, studying David's face. "You know, you have similar eyes. Same shape, same color." David stared at the photograph, something cold settling in his stomach. "What was her last name again?" "Martinez. Sarah Martinez." Michael was devastated when he had to leave her to follow his calling. That night, David couldn't sleep. There was something about that name, something his adoptive mother had mentioned years ago when he'd asked about his birth parents. He'd never pursued it, never really wanted to know, but now he couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, February 14th, 2022, their wedding day. David called his adoptive mother. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking, "I need to know something about my birth parents, the woman who gave me up for adoption. What was her name?" "Oh, honey," his adoptive mother replied. "Why are you asking about this today of all days? I thought you didn't want to know." "Please, Mom, it's important." There was a long pause. "Her name was Sarah Martinez, sweetie. She was very young, and the father had left her before you were born to become a priest." David dropped the phone. The room started spinning around him as the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Sarah Martinez, the woman in the photograph with Michael, was his birth mother. Michael Harrison, the man he was supposed to marry in 4 hours, was his father. For 20 minutes, David sat on his bed, staring at his hands. The same hands he'd seen in that photograph wrapped around his birth father. He thought about every conversation they'd had, every intimate moment they'd shared. Every time Michael had said he felt like David was family. The nausea hit him first, then the panic. He ran to the bathroom and was sick for what felt like hours. When he finally looked at himself in the mirror, he saw his father's eyes staring back at him, the same eyes he'd inherited from the man he'd fallen in love with. By noon, guests were already arriving at St. Matthew's Church. The altar had been decorated with white roses and candles. Michael was in his dressing room, nervous but excited about marrying the man who'd changed his life. He had no idea that his world was about to collapse. David knew he had to tell him. He couldn't let the ceremony proceed, couldn't let more people become part of this nightmare. With shaking hands, He called Michael's cell phone. "David, where are you?" Michael answered. "Guests are arriving and I haven't seen you all morning." "Michael, I need to see you. Alone. Right now." "Is everything okay? You sound... Please, meet me in the church office. Don't let anyone follow you." Michael found David sitting in the chair where they'd had their first real conversation over a year ago. But this wasn't the same young man who'd been searching for belonging and purpose. This was someone who looked broken, destroyed. "David, what's wrong? Talk to me." David looked up, and Michael saw something in those familiar brown eyes that made his blood run cold. "I know who I am," David whispered. "I know who my birth parents are." "Okay," Michael said slowly, moving closer. "And?" David pulled out his phone and showed Michael the photo he'd taken of the old picture the night before. Michael's arm around Sarah Martinez. Her name was Sarah Martinez. She gave birth to a son in 1996, a son she gave up for adoption because the father had left her to become a priest. The color drained from Michael's face. He stared at the photo, then at David, then back at the photo. The room started to tilt around him as the impossible truth became clear. "No," he breathed. "No, this can't be." "I'm your son," David said, his voice barely audible. "We're father and son, Michael, and in 2 hours we were supposed to get married." Michael Harrison sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. Every memory from the past year and a half replayed in his mind with horrifying new context. The connection he'd felt to David, the familiar features he couldn't place, the way David had seemed like the missing piece of his soul. "We have to stop the ceremony," David said, standing up abruptly. "We have to tell everyone the truth." "Wait," Michael grabbed his arm. "Just wait. Let me think." "Think about what?" David's voice was rising. "There's nothing to think about, Michael. This is over. This whole thing is over." Outside the office, they could hear the sounds of a church filling with guests. The wedding march was scheduled to begin in 90 minutes. Everything was ready, except the groom and his bride had just discovered they were father and son. "Nobody has to know," Michael whispered, his mind racing. "We could just call it off. Say we realized we weren't ready. We could... Nobody has to know." David stared at him in disbelief. "Michael, we've been intimate. We've been planning a life together. How can you say nobody has to know?" The weight of what they'd done, what they'd almost done, crashed down on both men. Michael buried his face in his hands, while David paced the small office like a caged animal. "I think I'm going to be sick again," David said, rushing toward the door. "David, wait." Michael followed him out into the hallway that led to the main church. They could see guests through the partially open doors. David's adoptive parents in the front row, Michael's sister Maria adjusting flowers near the altar, children from the Sunday school class scattered throughout the pews. "All these people came here to watch us get married," David said, his voice hollow. "Your sister, my parents, they have no idea what we've been doing, what we almost did." Michael felt something snap inside him. The shame, the horror, the realization that his entire life had been built on a lie. It was too much. "This is God's punishment," he said, his voice getting louder. "This is what I get for breaking my vows, for betraying everything I believed in." "Keep your voice down," David hissed, but it was too late. Maria Harrison had heard raised voices and was walking toward them. "Michael? David? Is everything all right?" She stopped when she saw their faces. "You both look like you've seen a ghost." Michael and David stared at each other, then at Maria. In that moment, they both realized that the truth would have to come out. There was no way to hide what they'd discovered, no way to pretend that everything was fine. "Maria," Michael said slowly, "I need to tell you something. About David. About who he really is." When Maria Harrison learned that her brother had been in a romantic relationship with his own son, When she understood that the wedding she'd helped plan was between a father and his child, she screamed. It wasn't a quiet gasp of shock, but a full-throated scream that echoed through the church halls and reached the ears of every guest waiting in the sanctuary. Within minutes, the news spread like wildfire. Whispered conversations turned into heated arguments. David's adoptive parents demanded answers. Church members who had supported Michael through his transition out of the priesthood felt betrayed and disgusted. The children from Sunday school were quickly ushered out by horrified parents. "How could you not know?" someone shouted from the crowd that had gathered in the church hallway. "How could a father not recognize his own son?" David stood in the center of the chaos, completely still while the world collapsed around him. He watched Michael try to explain to people who could no longer look at him without revulsion. He saw his adoptive mother crying and his adoptive father's face red with anger. 25 years, his adoptive father said, grabbing David by the shoulders. 25 years we raised you, loved you, and this is what you were doing? With your own father? "I didn't know," David whispered. "I swear to God, I didn't know." But the crowd wasn't interested in explanations. They wanted someone to blame, someone to punish for the abomination they'd witnessed. Michael, as the older man and former priest, became the target of their rage. "You were supposed to be a man of God," Mrs. Walsh spat at him. "You were supposed to guide people toward righteousness, not this." Michael tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but every word that came out of his mouth made things worse. "I loved him," he finally shouted over the crowd. "I loved him before I knew who he was. That has to count for something." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in that hallway, guests, family members, church officials, stared at Michael Harrison with a mixture of horror and pity. In trying to defend his love for David, he had admitted to the entire crowd that he'd been physically intimate with his own son. David couldn't take any more. The weight of everyone's stares, the shame of what he'd unknowingly participated in, the collapse of everything he'd thought his life was becoming. It was too much. He pushed through the crowd and ran toward the altar. David Harrison, because he'd legally changed his name in preparation for the marriage, stood at the altar where he was supposed to have pledged his love to the man who turned out to be his father. The white roses and candles that had been arranged for their ceremony now looked like decorations for a funeral. Behind him, he could hear the crowd still arguing, still trying to make sense of what had happened. Michael's voice rose above the others, desperately trying to convince people that neither of them had known the truth. "You have to understand," Michael was saying. "I left Sarah before I knew she was pregnant. I had no idea I had a son. When David came to the church, I felt a connection to him, but I thought it was spiritual. I thought it was God bringing someone into my life who needed guidance. And then you seduced him," someone shouted back. "You seduced your own child." "It wasn't like that." Michael's voice cracked with emotion. "We fell in love. It happened naturally over time. I would never have. If I had known." David turned around and walked back toward the crowd. Everyone fell silent when they saw his face. There was something different about him now, something cold and final. "Stop," he said quietly, but his voice carried through the church. "All of you, just stop talking." He looked at Michael, the man he'd thought he was going to spend his life with. "Do you know what the worst part of this is?" he asked. "It's not that we're father and son. It's not even that we were intimate. The worst part is that I still love you. Even now, knowing what you are to me, I still love you." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "David." "And I hate myself for it," David continued. "I hate myself more than I've ever hated anything in my entire life." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made several people in the crowd gasp. It was a knife. A small ceremonial blade that had been part of the wedding decorations, meant to cut the wedding cake. "David, put that down," his adoptive father said, stepping forward slowly. "Son, put the knife down." "I'm not your son," David replied without taking his eyes off Michael. "And I'm not his son either. I don't know what I am anymore." What happened next lasted only seconds, but everyone who witnessed it would remember every detail for the rest of their lives. David didn't turn the knife on himself like many people expected. Instead, he walked straight toward Michael with deliberate, measured steps. "If you had stayed with my mother," David said, his voice eerily calm, "none of this would have happened. If you hadn't abandoned her to become a priest, I would have grown up knowing who my father was. I would never have come looking for something I'd already lost." Michael understood what was about to happen, but he didn't run. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was guilt, or maybe, on some level, he felt he deserved whatever was coming. "I loved you," David said, stopping directly in front of Michael. "I loved you more than I've ever loved anyone, and you destroyed that. You destroyed me." The knife went in just below Michael's ribcage, angled upward toward his heart. Michael's eyes went wide with surprise more than pain, and he reached out to touch David's face one last time. "I'm sorry," Michael whispered as blood began to soak through his white shirt. "I'm so sorry, son." Those were the last words Michael Harrison ever spoke. The screaming that followed Michael Harrison's murder was different from the shocked outrage that had erupted earlier. This was primal terror, the sound of people witnessing something their minds couldn't fully process. Blood spread across the marble floor of St. Matthew's Church, while David stood over his father's body, still holding the knife. Police sirens could be heard in the distance. Someone had called 911 during the confrontation. David looked down at Michael's still form, then at the blood on his hands, and seemed to wake up from whatever trance had possessed him. "Oh God," he whispered, dropping the knife. "Oh God, what have I done?" He collapsed to his knees beside Michael's body, his hands hovering over the wound as if he could somehow take back what he'd just done. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late for Michael Harrison. David Harrison was arrested at the scene, still covered in his father's blood, still mumbling apologies to a man who could no longer hear them. The story exploded across New York media within hours. "Priest murdered by son. He was set to marry," read the headline in the New York Post. Cable news shows picked up the story, talking heads debated the psychological implications, and social media erupted with reactions ranging from horrified sympathy to cruel jokes. The trial that followed was a media circus. David's defense attorney argued that the discovery of his true relationship to Michael had caused a complete psychological break, that no person could be expected to remain rational after learning they'd been in an incestuous relationship with their own father. The prosecution countered that murder was still murder, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. During the trial, more details emerged about the relationship between David and Michael. Text messages were read aloud in court. Intimate conversations between two people who had no idea they were father and son. Hotel receipts showed the extent of their physical relationship. Character witnesses spoke about how happy both men had seemed during their courtship. Sarah Martinez, David's birth mother, was called to testify. She was in her late 40s now, married with 2 other children, who had no idea they had a half-brother sitting in the defendant's chair. Through tears, she confirmed that she had been in a relationship with Michael Harrison in 1995, that she had gotten pregnant shortly before he left for seminary, and that she had given birth to David 9 months later. "I never told Michael about the pregnancy," she sobbed on the witness stand. "He was so committed to his calling, so sure that God wanted him to be a priest. I thought I was doing the right thing by letting him go, by giving the baby to a family who could provide for him." The most heartbreaking testimony came from David himself. For 3 hours he described falling in love with Michael, feeling like he'd finally found where he belonged, planning their future together. He spoke about the morning he discovered the truth, about the physical revulsion and psychological trauma of realizing what they'd been doing. "I keep thinking about all the times he said I felt like family to him," David said, his voice barely audible. "All the times he said we belonged together. He was right, but not in the way either of us thought." David Harrison was ultimately convicted of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder in the first degree, The jury accepted the argument that the discovery of his incestuous relationship with his father had caused extreme emotional disturbance that led to his actions. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. During the sentencing hearing, David addressed the court one final time. "I want everyone to understand that Michael Harrison was not a monster," he said. "He was a good man who made a terrible mistake 25 years ago when he abandoned my mother. Everything that happened after that, our meeting, our relationship, the tragedy at the altar, it all stemmed from that one decision." He paused, looking directly at Sarah Martinez, who was sitting in the gallery. "I don't blame my birth mother for giving me up for adoption. I don't blame my adoptive parents for loving me and trying to protect me. I don't even blame Michael for not recognizing me. I was a baby when he left, and 25 years is a long time. But I do blame myself," he continued, "for not stopping things earlier. There were moments when I felt something wasn't right, when the connection between us felt too strong to be normal. I ignored those feelings because I wanted so badly to belong somewhere, to be loved by someone who understood me." The case sparked national conversations about adoption disclosure laws, about the psychological impacts of parental abandonment, and about how seemingly small decisions can have catastrophic consequences decades later. Some advocated for mandatory DNA testing before marriages, while others argued that such measures would create more problems than they solved. St. Matthew's Church was eventually demolished. The congregation, unable to move past the scandal, disbanded and sold the property to developers. Where once there had been a place of worship, there now stands a luxury apartment building. But long-time residents of the neighborhood say they can still feel the weight of what happened there, the tragedy of two people who loved each other in the most forbidden way possible. As I finish telling you this story, I want you to think about the secrets in your own life. Not the harmful ones, but the information you don't know about your family, your history, your origins. David Harrison spent his entire life searching for where he came from, and when he finally found it, it destroyed him. What if Sarah Martinez had told Michael about her pregnancy before he left for seminary? What if David's adoptive parents had been more open about his birth parents? What if Michael had stayed in touch with his past instead of trying to erase it completely? Any one of these small changes could have prevented the tragedy at St. Matthew's Church. The truth is, we're all connected in ways we don't fully understand. The decisions we make today can echo through generations, affecting people we haven't even met yet. Michael Harrison thought he was answering God's call when he became a priest, but in abandoning Sarah and his unborn son, he set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy them both. Love, as Father Michael Harrison used to preach, comes in many forms, but some forms of love are too dangerous to exist, even when the people involved are innocent of knowing why. What do you think about this tragic story? Could you imagine discovering something this devastating about someone you love? How do you think you would react if you found yourself in David's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and if you made it to the end of this story, comment, "Secrets never stay buried," to let me know you were here for this entire heartbreaking journey. If you want to hear more true crime stories that will make you question everything you think you know about human nature, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because the next story I'm going to tell you is even more shocking than this one, and it involves a family secret that stayed hidden for 40 years before exploding in the most unexpected way. Until next time, remember that the people we love the most might be the ones hiding the biggest secrets. And sometimes, the truth we're searching for is the last thing we'd ever want to find.